Well, I'm taking it on from where you left, basically, and where my colleague Hartmut Meyer left. It makes me almost envious to hear where you are now in the chemicals assessment, because I'm dreaming of the day that EU officials or administrators and policymakers will come up to us and say, please come up with new environmental risk assessment themes and concepts and new ways to assess it, because we haven't, the old way of doing it wasn't sufficiently good, and we need new ways. We have been developing in the GMO fields, we are developing new concepts, and we're fighting tooth and nail, and the EU and the EFSA is fighting tooth and nail to not being forced to accept them. And it's been an uphill battle, and I'll present some of that, what kinds of uphill battles we encountered, and what types of strategies were applied or are being applied in order to avoid that we are doing a better job on risk assessment. Because much of what was done with GMOs was they adopted, basically, to the degree possible, one-to-one, what has been done in the chemicals, in the old ways of chemicals. So they treated GMOs, organisms, as chemicals, effectively. I could give a whole talk on that, and that's usually, what I publish on and what I do about. But this talk will take a bit more a broader view on other components that went into this that we're fighting for, and we're trying to get changes being implemented. So we're in the Stone Ages still, like 30 years before where you seem to be. And part of it is because of this, because in parallel we have been seeing, through the introduction of patents, through new property rights given to organisms, we had a whole host of new issues, or we still have them, to deal with that you may not have had to the degree in chemicals. At least chemicals are not organisms, which always adds another dimension in dynamics and in biology to the whole thing, because you're right, 1 and 1 in biology is not necessarily 2. But what is it, and how do you affect that? So just that you get an idea, taking on from Dr. Meyer, this is how an agreement looks like if a farmer in a producer country purchases seeds. All right, so I'll leave it up there for a little while, but the critical part for us is the one that's in the black box. You see that the farmer gets material. Oh, it's cut off again. This is unfortunate. It says you receive, you have the opportunity to purchase, plant, and grow maize. That's about a GM maize that uses the Monsanto maize technology listed above. And here comes what you are under signing. And Monsanto maize technology is protected under the US law. You still don't see that. And Monsanto licenses you the application patents it owns or licensed to use this technology as contained in your seed purchases under the conditions listed below. And these are the conditions. You understand that. And you agree to use the seed containing Monsanto maize technology only for planting a commercial crop in one single season, meaning of course you have to rebuy it from them again and again, and you do not supply any of the seed to any other person or entity for any purpose. If you do so, you will be fined. And you agree to not use the seed for crop breeding, research, or seed production. A farmer is not even allowed to compare and do research on his own with it and sort of convey then the outcome. If he uses a seed of this variety, compares it to another variety, a non-GM variety, for example, and runs around and tells him, you know what, this conventional seed works better than the patented seed. And you're certainly not allowed to give any of the material to a researcher who does this in a formal scientific way. And this is why in the US what happened, what Dr. Meyer was presenting to you, that scientists who worked for decades with the developers and with the companies and have no problem with the technology, to add, I know a number of these scientists who wrote these letters and finally said they can't do their job anymore. They have no problem with the technology, but they really got into a dead-end road where they felt they cannot do their job anymore. And there is some of them, even if they get funding from the companies, they still feel they want to serve the public. They want to do at least a good job for the farmers. So that's a motivation of many of the applied entomologists. I'm an entomologist myself, and the entomologists that I know from the US, they want to do a good job and want that this technology works for the farmers. And they came to the point where they felt we can't even do that job anymore. And that's how the whole thing started. So just that you get an idea, the environment our colleagues in the US work under, and to the degree also we in the EU work under, because Monsanto tries, of course, to apply that to the degree possible to us as well. So there is complete control of the corporations over the research material, which is the critical issue for any scientist. You need access to the research material. If that's controlled, that is pretty much the end of the story right there. They control, of course, the research process and the entire scientific process by influencing what types of research questions, hypotheses can be formulated, where the money should go, of course. That's a typical political lobbying. They also fund professor positions at academic institutions under their terms and conditions. And all good, but they also influence the regulations and the execution of the regulations writing. And this is what my talk will focus on from our scientific perspective, and I'm sure that Claire Robertson will go into the battles that the civil society trying to make use of the laws that and of the regulations and the possibilities they had in order to force EFSA, which is our main body that makes those decisions, to behave well and for the public interest rather than for the industry interest. And that's been an uphill battle since, at least since I'm in this, since over 14 years. So EFSA was under pressure. They had guidelines installed for environmental risk assessment. It's part of the regulations in the EU that you have to do risk assessment with GMOs. Those risk assessment procedures we did not agree with. I indicated they treated basically a plant like a chemical and tried to the degree possible to adhere to the minimum, the absolute minimum standards that you could possibly do in the chemicals registration. So that worked for a while, but then the critical mass and the pressure increased to a point where EFSA was then finally asked to revise those guidelines because they were not met by consensus and there was no way forward. So they finally accepted that job. They went over the ERA guidelines, the risk assessment guidelines, and came up with a new revised version 2010, I believe it was already. And ENSA has extensively commented on those revisions, and we've been participating in this also in Brussels meetings, etc., etc. And this is a bit of a summary of some of the elements that we've been criticizing and that we still are quite unhappy, because we must say much of the revisions, once they had the revised guideline, they weren't accepting. Okay, you have the mechanism of stating your voice, you have the mechanism of presenting it all, you're invited to Brussels and so on, but if in the end, when you read the documents again after the hearing period and the revision period, nothing much has changed. But that is, I guess, not new. So just a quick input to what the regulatory or the status is. They want to make it, give it a regulatory status. So this is going to be binding, and we will have to be living with it for quite some time. And if it is adopted by the member states, and this is where we're in, as far as I understand, it's not fully adopted by the member states. It's not, but we have been going through a number of revision circulations, and as I said, many of the issues, or some of the critical issues for us, remain, unfortunately. What we have seen, what a positive outcome of the revisions of the guideline was that they included for a part of it, what we call the non-target organisms, or the insects that are not being targeted by some of the applications and could be affected, that the risk assessment concepts we have been developing for that have been taken up. And we told the EU that this is acknowledged, we understand, you've taken it up, you included it, and this is fantastic. And this is just to make this point again. We've noticed that, and we acknowledge that, and we find that quite positive. So finally, we have now in the risk assessment for non-target organisms, we have ecological criteria, finally, that are applied to selecting the organisms. In previous times, they just used what they've done at the chemicals testing, a standard set of uniform species, but I'm not going into those details. They finally, with that, included and recognized the receiving environment, so the species are actually existing in the environment that are being selected. They're using realistic routes of exposures, or should be using it. I mean, the rules have to be taken into effect once they are adopted. The transgene product is included in the testing, and the GMO is included in the testing. Previously, it was only the transgene product. So this is what they came up with. Just to say, they came up with a tiered process. Still, again, leaning very much towards the chemical side, but they did a better job in formulating it. However, they still have individual points in there which we disagree. For example, this first point up there, I'm not sure you can read it up there. It says one selection criteria is of a non-target organism, whether or not it's going to be tested against the transgene product and the transgenic plant, is its known selectivity or its known susceptibility to the compound. Well, we say that this is not a selection criteria, it's actually what you want to be testing, all right? If you test a non-target organism that you don't know anything about, whether or not it's sensitive, you cannot exclude it based on that you don't know whether or not it's sensitive. That's the virtue of having a non-target organism. It's usually not been tested before, and that's exactly the point why you want to do that. You want to test it and not exclude it. So we have a lot of problems with this particular point, but there's other points that are agreeable. However, having said that, there is two new elements they've been introducing into the whole procedure that stems directly from the industry science. And this is the comparative safety assessment. And that is a totally new even as a general principle that they weren't even asked to do. And this comparative safety assessment is in essence nothing else but a rewording and a reinstitutioning of the concept of substantial equivalence we have been touching on yesterday. That's highly controversial, and there's no scientific consensus that this is of value for risk assessment. It's used and criticized in the context of GM food safety, and it has not been accepted to this point as a useful approach for environmental risk assessment. All right, it is part of the food assessment in the codex, but also there it's restricted in its meaning. Now here it is included. What it does, it decides the ecological relevance of an organism being subjected to the ERA is decided on outcomes of this test for concept of familiarity, and that is based in essence on understanding some of fairly crude differences between a GMO, a GM plant mainly, compared to its parent plants, the untransformed parent plants. And this is based primarily on measuring primary compounds like protein, amino acids, ash content, carbohydrate content, and so on. Very basic, crude parameters, primary compounds of a plant that tells you, in essence, this is maize, and it's not soybean or something, okay? So you can characterize and say a plant that has this composition of primary compounds is likely to be a maize and not soybean, but that's about the extent you can say. And you have the possibility of comparing your individual values of protein, of amino acids and all of that to any type of comparator that carries the species name. Okay, and so when you go in the dossiers and you look what they deliver, there's some values could be dating back. I've seen them in the 30s, 1930s or something, that have ever been published on maize anywhere, which could be a content of a certain amino acid in any maize. And based on that, I am pretty convinced you could not even say a difference between a sorghum and a maize if you only would leave it to this, but this remains to be tested. I'm thinking of doing that sometime, just running those primary compounds with sorghum, rice, maize, and then see whether you would ever actually be able to distinguish rice from maize and from sorghum or not. So this concept has obviously been very controversial, especially since none of these criteria are really defined. You do find always, when you look at those comparisons in amino acids, so you do always find significant differences. You find significant differences to the parent plants. You find significant differences to any of the other comparators. You find a whole number of the significant differences, but nobody has ever established how many significant differences and what a degree of that significant difference can take on before it actually is not substantially equivalent anymore. So none of these things are being defined in with clear-cut cutoff points where you say, okay, if the difference is beyond and above a certain threshold, then we consider it to be not substantially equivalent anymore. That doesn't exist. It's totally up to, and I've never seen any case where they said it's not equivalent. It's been a concept that was introduced by the OECD in the early 90s as a first sort of step towards how do we deal with GMOs and with GM plants. It was rejected in the negotiations on the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety in 1998 for risk assessment, and hence was not taken up by the Directive 2001/18 because it was so controversial for its meaning and its relevance in environmental risk assessment, which is an integral component of the regulations in the 2001/18 and Cartagena. So they also included with this comparative safety assessment certain decision-making steps. They said if in the case you find a difference, that difference must be shown to be consistent, whatever that means. It has to be non-transient in nature, and it has to be biological relevant. So you can see how many, you leave the door open to any type. None of this is clearly defined. Nobody has defined what is biological relevant of a significant difference in 5 amino acid compounds between two plants. That there is just no research or no scientific credible body of science out there where you could base this upon and make any informed decision. It's entirely up to the discretion and the interpretation of the producer or of any group of people who say, we don't think this is biologically relevant. And what is of non-transient nature, as if transient effects were biologically irrelevant. There is a lot of transient effects that come and go that can have massive ecological or biological impacts. Or what does consistency mean? Does it have to stay consistent for 1 season, for 2 seasons, 3 seasons, or 4 weeks? Or what does it mean? There's none of that is defined. Unintended effects will only be included if they pass all of this. All right? So you're not looking into any unless you fulfill any of these criteria at the discretion and interpretation of some group of people. So we find this rather vague and rather unscientific, actually. We rather have some cutoff points of data that tell you what is a biologic relevant and what not, and so on, but that doesn't exist. So it is also in contradiction to regulations 1829/2003, which states that whilst substantial equivalence is a key step in the procedure for the assessment of the safety of GM foods, it's the foods, it is not a safety assessment in itself, and even the Codex states that the concept of substantial equivalence is a key step in the safety assessment process. However, it is not a safety assessment by itself. And yet here we have introduced into the environmental risk assessment a step that is called explicitly comparative safety assessment, which is nothing else in its formulation, in its technical detail, the substantial equivalence. So we told all of this. This is part of a paper we sent to the EU. It is also in contradiction to 2001/18 that doesn't have substantial equivalence in there for the reasons I stated, and it has 5 general principles that have to work in accordance with the precautionary principle, and those are the analysis of cumulative long-term effects. That's what the directive spells out and wants to see the ERA to address, cumulative long-term effects. And it states clearly that the comparison ought to be made between the GMO and its parent organisms. All right, it's not talking about a maize variety where you find data from the 1930s. It speaks about the maize varieties you have been transforming and what is the difference between those. And it is one scientifically sound, transparent manner. That's what we all want. That's what we fight for. So we agree fully with that. And it has to be on a case-by-case basis. This is basically what you call the substance-by-substance basis, is what we have case-by-case. And it states that if new information comes up, you have to readdress environmental risk assessment, meaning there is a feedback process, and it's a revisiting of your earlier conclusions, because we understand that this field is still fairly new, the technology is fairly new, and we're generating and learning basically every day and on new things about the technology as well as the products it produces. Now, the EFSA principles, now that they've come up with in their revised guidelines, are not addressing cumulative long-term effects as a standard goal. It goes by a very, very tiered approach that only substances or plants will be tested that fulfill all of the previous, show differences that are beyond and above anything ever measured, that are non-transient, that are biologically relevant, and what was the third one? I forgot. All of these criteria, and only then you start looking into this. So it's never going to get to a cumulative approach testing. That's my prediction. And this comparison with the parental organisms was replaced by the comparative approach in the substance equivalence term, and the concept of familiarity was reintroduced. But what we also find quite intriguing is where in the entire process that EFSA devised this was positioned. It was positioned right at the beginning of the assessment process, prior to the actual ERA, the risk assessment process. And we believe that this will serve as a sort of a funnel where you already sort out all kinds of GMOs that even are ever going to be submitted to an ERA, that, for instance, all the herbicide-resistant plants and all the BT plants that are on the market already since decades will be sorted out based on this familiarity concept, because we know it, it's been declared safe, and so on. We don't need to look at those anymore. So in essence, excluding and exempting most of the new combinations that are coming up now, like the Smart Stacks that combines 6 BT toxins and 2 herbicide resistance, glyphosate and glufosinate and glyphosate in it, will not be subjected to extensive ERA anymore based on the previous experience we have. How much time do I have? Because I'm running 2 minutes. They introduced a new one, and I zoomed through that. Element called problem formulation. That's not even been in any of the rulings before. We do agree with that, actually. We feel that it's been also our work that's been stimulating that this goes in there, because we've been publishing and working on this and developing concepts for problem formulation and options assessment, actually, since almost, we started in 2002, published our first papers and books on that in 2004, and then 6 and 8, and came up with a handbook on how to do problem formulation and options assessment. And this has kicked off a process and the development that this term and this idea was in the discussion and then made it into the regulations. So we recognize that. This is just a list of publications that came out of that project with a bunch of people. Now, interestingly, we had published our first the concept and brought the notion to the table and into the discussion in 2004, notably, and 2006, Syngenta, Dr. Ray Boole published a paper the first time, which was a counter-proposal to what we had done 2 years later. Yet again, and we published another one 2006, if you remember, and 2008 Monsanto came forward with a counter-proposal, and now 2010 we have another one that is sort of countering that. So there's 3 publications here from the industries and industry aligned circles of how to do problem formulation, and I skip that because it's just to document that it's been taken up now. It's been taken up here also by EFSA, just to show you. So problem formulation is in. It's been taken up. So again, we consider this to a certain degree a success that we brought this to the discussion and it's been included. However, they included only, and I go to the list, I'm sorry, they included only the industry concept. They, in the first round of their guidelines, they didn't even mention any of our publications, which we felt if we're dealing in EFSA with a body of experts of the field, they ought to at least have a command of what has been published on it and understand that there is a variety of different proposals out there, and then say and justify why they only stick with one proposal and do not consider the other proposal. But if they don't even cite the other bulk of publications, and this was no unknown minor publications, they were well aware of it, it either means they don't want it or they don't understand that this is relevant, which would be pretty bad for an expert panel, I would think, or there's some other reason why they completely ignore a well-known, well-established, well-discussed piece of science that had been formulated by a group of scientists that they all knew about. So this was my, I'm sorry I had to cut short on the problem formulation part, but we made this was voiced to the EU, to the Commission. We wrote several papers on it. You can find them on our website, and we will continue to pressure that they include or at least consider and transparently explain if there is choices out there that everybody knows, you have concepts as you know that are out there that address this issue. If you stick to one and if you only choose, especially here, an exclusive industry model, which is totally different from what we have been suggesting, you have to explain why that is. And that's why we're facing them with that. Thank you.